It's interesting you ask that question. Will science be able to answer stuff of the heart, the poet? Because that's exactly what I'm interested in the moment. At the moment is the actual science of our imagination, how our imagination, our thoughts, emotions can actually program our genes and change our lives and change our environment. So previously, to put those two words together, the science of imagination would have been considered quite heretical, because normally in science we keep the stuff of imagination and the stuff of the mystic, the bigger picture, the transcendental, well out of the lab, because we see them as not relevant to scientific endeavour, because imagination is it's actually the mental faculty of creating images of objects that are not present to the senses, and belief is actually taking on that those imagined objects are true, and obviously imagination and belief are totally in the way of scientific progress, because imagination isn't seen as reality, and a belief is certainly drummed out of the young scientist very early on as a story that would really get in the way of making valid discoveries. So, but now I am beginning to see the crossover between science and imagination, because it's our inner environment, our imagination, is programming our genes in a way that affects our whole lives, and in fact the lives of future generations. That's a new aspect of epigenetics, which has been part of my work in the 80s, early on.
Wow, is this incontrovertible, Marilyn? Is the reprogramming of our genes as a result of our thought patterns, is this accepted now and understood?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of evidence accumulating. Obviously we knew that the whole nature-nurture debate, is it our genes that are controlling our life, or our environment that's regulating our life? And it's not one against the other. It's somehow at the interface of our genes with the environment. And up until recently, since the discovery of DNA, there's been the what's called the central dogma, that genes are everything, that your DNA makes RNA, makes protein, and that's who you are, basically. But now much more important and of course that was very much fueled by the whole endeavour to sequence the human genome, and it was thought that once we had the sequence of all the 20,000 genes, well, at the time they were thought to be 100,000 genes, but now we know there's 20,000 genes, and we'd know every gene, and we'd be able to sequence the genome of every person, and it would solve all problems of disease and illness and so on. But that's not been the case, because I see that it's the programming of our genes by epigenetic programming, deciding which genes are on in the cells and which genes are off according to the environment, is more important than the genes themselves. And I suppose what brings imagination in is that normally we think of our environment as what's out there, what you see around you, whereas it's best to consider your environment extending from the core of your being to the end of the cosmos. And if I were to actually make a distinction, which is a false distinction, we could think of our inner environment, our thoughts, our feelings, emotions, our imagination, what we expect out of life, preconceived ideas and so on. That inner environment, I think, is even more important in programming us for our life view and our health, in terms of lifestyle diseases, mental illness, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, stroke, cancer, and so on. It's actually your inner environment is incredibly important in terms of your programming of your genes in all your cells.
It's a huge thing to take on board. It's like, it feels intuitive in so many ways, but it goes against, again, some things that so many of us hold to be a truism in our society, which is actually we are much more predetermined through our genetics.
Well, epigenetics is the programming of the genes in our cells and deciding which genes are on and which are off by modifications superimposed upon the genes. You could consider that our genes are the hardware, an analogy with a computer, and the epigenetic programming is the software, and it's the programming that's all important. And obviously it was known in terms of the different cell types in your body. So like all cells in your body are in service to you, a higher order structure, and there's a division of labor and they're doing different things. So they all have the same 20,000 genes, but nerve cells have nerve genes on, muscle cells have muscle genes on, etc., etc., so that they turn off the other genes so that they have all these different functions according to requirement for function in a specific tissue. So it's been known for some time that the genes in your cells are programmed for the cells to perform different functions, and the term epigenetics was coined by Waddington in the 40s and the 50s, but we didn't know the mechanisms. And so a lot of my work in the 80s was concerned with discovering one of the mechanisms, which is a chemical modification of one of the bases of DNA, and methylation of the base. And if methylation has occurred on that DNA base cytosine in a regulated region of the gene, that gene's turned off. So my work was partly concerned with that, and showing that the modification could indeed go through sperm and egg, which is a really important discovery, because the dismissal of Lamarckian inheritance, transmitting traits to your offspring according to the way you live your life, was thrown out with the discovery of DNA and the central dogma, because nobody could think of a possible mechanism. So I suppose what's happened in the 80s and since is that we know now the mechanisms of turning the genes on and off. And in addition, so we know that in the fetus, when it's developing in the womb, as the genes are programmed in the different cells to make nerve cells and muscle cells, the heart and the liver and the different organs. So we know we call that tissue-specific epigenetic programming to make the different organs of the fetus. But there's an awful lot of programming also going on in the womb and in the newborn, and in fact throughout life, that's affecting your, what I call inclusively, life view, the sense of your potential in life, and also programming your future health and longevity and your well-being. So this was all known at the whole person level. So at the whole person level, we knew intuitively, didn't we, that positive thinking and imaging and living a peaceful life were very good for your health. And then there was some scientific studies done with large cohorts of people in America to show that things like religion's good for your health, and living in a safe environment, being educated, being married, having a good social network, all these things were shown to affect your health, but it was not known how. Okay, and also research at the whole person level is very difficult because of reverse causality. Do you have a better well-being because you're married, or you're married because you already had a better well-being? And also count, what's called confounding influences, getting your groups exactly the same, except one group meditates and the other one doesn't. But now we know how this works at the epigenetic level, the actual programming of genes that are concerned with lifelong stress, and can occur in the developing fetus if the mother's stressed, or according to her nutrition, or whether she's drinking and smoking. So we can show it now at the genetic level, genes being turned off and on that are going to affect that baby for life. And then immediately after birth, the newborn's being adapted to the physical, nutritional, emotional, psychological environment, so that if there's neglect, abandonment, abuse, and so on in childhood, that child is being, the genes are being programmed for stress and increased likelihood of illness. So now we know that, how it's working, we can actually identify the genes that are being turned off.
Does this diminish to some degree our previous perception of how important genes were? But does it almost negate them fully?
The genes are important, but more important than that is how they're programmed on and off. It's like the software is more important than the hardware in terms of your the way you live your life and what's available to you and how stressed you are and so on. That's It doesn't make them less important, but it makes the programming of them very important.
What about transgenerational epigenetics?
During pregnancy, you've got to distinguish different levels of gene programming. There's obviously tissue-specific gene programming. All cells in the body have the same 20,000 genes, but they do different things according to the programming of these genes. Certain different subpopulations are on and the rest are off. There are some genes called housekeeping genes that are on all cells, and they're genes concerned with growth and division, repair and so on. But then there are other tissue-specific genes that makes nerve, nerve, muscle, muscle, skin, skin, that are only on in the cells where they're required for function, and in the other cells they're turned off. So that's called tissue-specific gene programming, and we now know that's by epigenetic modification of the genes to turn them on or off. And it's heritable cell to cell, because obviously your muscle cell is a muscle. It divides and makes another muscle cell. And so it's heritable cell to cell. So these modifications are heritable through cell division. And then you have what you could call it adaptive gene programming, adapting cells to the environment. So if the environment is poisonous or stressful, then there are genes, like if the mother's stressed, then the fetus is going to be programmed for stress as well. For instance, there's a gene in hippocampus called the glucocorticoid receptor, and its job is to mop up cortisols and get rid of them. Cortisol is a stress molecule produced by the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals, and the cortisol gets mopped up by the glucocorticoid receptor. But if the stress is prolonged in the mother and the fetus, the gene gets methylated and turned off in a heritable way, because the methylation modification is inherited throughout life. So you've got this adaptive programming that adapts to emotional, psychological environment. And that's also happening in the fetus, and particularly in the newborn. So you could ask in the newborn, if the environment is abusive, if there's neglect, abandonment, then it's like a big shutdown. Like I said, Pavlov called it transmarginal inhibition. The whole system seems to shut down. It's like it's making the individual less sensitive. But of course, if you're less sensitive, you're less compassionate and less caring for others. And so there's trouble from the beginning. So that's adaptive programming. The central dogma, DNA, the genes are all and govern your life. The whole idea of Lamarckian inheritance, Darwin was Lamarckian. He thought, I'm very cautious using the believe, what he might have observed, that the way we live our lives affects future generations. But that's complicated because it could be cultural inheritance. And cultural inheritance is an inheritance that has got nothing to do with the genes. It's like you bring up your kids a certain way, you have certain customs and traditions, and your kids will carry those customs and traditions forward, but it's nothing to do with the genes. The so-called Lamarckian inheritance, the idea that the giraffe's neck is long because it's reaching up for leaves, because it's reaching up, then somehow you change the genes, so the progeny inherit long necks, or the blacksmith's muscles, he develops muscles, so his kids will have bigger muscles. That so-called Lamarckian inheritance was definitely thrown out because they couldn't see a molecular mechanism. But we and others showed that this modification of a gene in an individual can actually be transmitted through the sperm and the egg into the next generation, so that the offspring can inherit the gene already off. And so that provides the molecular mechanism. The reason I'm hesitating here is that one of the other things that we discovered was what we call deprogramming, that early in development, the sperm and the egg cells carry on their genes, programming to make sperm, programming to make eggs. And in the first week or so of development, 1 cell to 2 cells, 4 cells to 8 cells, these programs have to be erased. And what we showed was that the methylation modification of the genes in the sperm and egg which was different, was wiped out in the first week of development. It's called deprogramming, and it leads to the totipotent tabula rasa stem cell that's going to make the new individual. So for a gene that's been modified in the parents to go through to the offspring, it has to escape this erasure and be taken into the somatic cells and germ cells of the offspring. But we showed that happens. That definitely does happen. The way we live our lives we have more longitudinal responsibility because it's going into the next generations and beyond. And rather than what we mostly think is we have lateral responsibility, we have to look after everybody around us, but we're also responsible for future generations. And if our imagination, our inner environment, is programming our genes for stress, etc., well-being, then even the way we think, our life view and the way we see our lives is really important for future generations.